Dustin Baker, VikesNow. We're going to talk about the upcoming Week 5 contest with the 3-1 Vikings, the 2-2 Bears. Somehow they've won 2 games. We're going to jump into it. We're going to talk about storylines. The Vikings won last weekend at the Saints, as you know. But let's do storylines that some of them you probably know, already have on your mind. Others you might be like, oh, I see moment. But from 1 to 8, we shall go through them. This will be the final time I speak with the group until, Monday, and then we will rehash some of this game before we start to look ahead to the Dolphins game, which I am going to with my wife. So, number 1, Vikings, Bears, storyline. It's the first time. First of all, this isn't a storyline, but if it feels weird that the Bears are coming to play in Minneapolis this early in the season, that's correct. It's the first time the Bears have played in Minneapolis before the month of November since 2006. The two teams always play in the latter part of the season, and as of late, near the end of the damn thing. All right. The first storyline is that this is Justin Fields' first trip as a starter at any level of football to the city of Minneapolis. Why does this matter? Well, there's still a chance that the guy figures it out. I know he sucks right now. He looks rotten. He's kind of in that Baker Mayfield territory of shittiness right now. But there is a chance that he does eventually get good. Remember once upon a time where it was rumored that the Vikings tried to get him? Whew, thank goodness they didn't do that. But here's the deal. He'll be the Bears starter at least for probably another year and a half before they realize that he isn't good or he completely turns it around. And this is kind of like Mitchell Trubisky. A little known fact, unless you really study this stuff like I do, is that teams led by Mitch Trubisky were 5-2 against the Vikings. So he personally didn't have problems with the team getting wins. So we'll see how much worse or better Fields is than Trubisky. But on the whole, on his first trip to Minneapolis, it's whether or not Ed Donatell, the Vikings defensive coordinator, can contain Fields. What the hell does this guy mean by that? Well, Ed Donatell, as of late, notoriously struggles against mobile quarterbacks. We talked about that before and after the Eagles game. I warned you guys on a tip from Josh Fry, who comes on this show every Wednesday, that this Donatell character really doesn't do well against mobile quarterbacks. And that little factoid turned out to be vindicated. The Vikings looked atrocious against Hurts and the Eagles. I believe the stat last year with the embattled Broncos was that Donatell was 5-1 against, I think it was about 5-1 against non-mobile quarterbacks, and then completely flipped 1-5 against mobile quarterbacks, something strange like that. I can't remember the exact stat, but it was completely flipped, and it was underwater in a bad way for mobile quarterbacks. So this is a get-right game against this mobile quarterback. If there ever was one of those for Ed Donatell to, get back to basics, stopping mobile quarterbacks, it would be Justin Fields. However, as a defensive coordinator, Mr. Donatell struggles with mobile quarterbacks. So I will be at this game too, and I'll be watching for that immediately. Is Fields going to be one of those dudes that finally gets off the schneid against this Vikings, whose defense has been porous in 4 games? Let's hope not. Speaking of get-right games, that's my number 2. I am assuming that the Vikings win this game. Hopefully that isn't a deadly assumption, but I want to know if this is a proverbial get-right game where all is well in the world, and Minnesota just shellacks them 31-3. That's my prediction. Or if it's another squeaker, because for the last 2 weeks against the Lions and the Saints, you've had ho-hum football where the offense and defense feel like they turn it on when it matters and win the game. We'll take it, but if they want to be a true blue contender for the whole tamale, they can't just eke out games against meh opponents. The Saints, whether you like it or not, were a meh opponent without Jameis Winston, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, and Andrews Peat. The Lions, bless their heart, have this high-octane offense, but the defense is no good. So I want to know, when it's all said and done, is this finally the game, kind of like the Week 1 game, where it was wow, if you're like me, you're driving home, or the rest of you is in Minneapolis, you've turned off the television at 3:45, transitioning to the rest of your day, whether that's more football or the family stuff or just kicking it, drinking, you want to know, that's the game that I wanted to see right there. I wanted to see them beat the shit out of the Bears, and by golly, they did it. Or are you going to be like, woo, win's a win. We upended those bastards 13-10. We'll take it 4-1. Nothing's going to stop us now. I want to know if it's a get-right game or another squeaker. Number 3 is, does Cousins begin his post-Week 5 annual terror in a good way? This man, Kirk Daniel Cousins, notoriously starts slow. I believe it is because it's inherently in his nature to, feel it out, and then he usually has a new offensive coordinator every year. It's a new guy, just by happenstance that you look up, oh, look, it's a new offensive coordinator for Mr. Cousins. This year is no different. And this, right now, like this week, Week 5, whether he played for the Commanders or the Vikings, is usually when Cousins really gets good. This is when you'll hear like the mini MINI MVP whispers about him. They never come to fruition. But last year, this is about the time on the calendar now until the end of November, like clockwork, where Kirk Cousins plays his best football. It should not be any different this year. It should be enhanced because of this lovely offensive thinker that leads the Minnesota Vikings. But let's face it, so far Cousins has been pretty good. They're 3-1. Can't bitch too much, but he hasn't been gangbusters. He hasn't been the normal, lovable 30 touchdowns, 10 picks guy. He's thrown a little bit more picks than you'd like, especially against the Eagles. And then they've had problems in the red zone and third down. So in accordance with how he usually conducts business in his life right now, Week 5 is where he gets going, and it goes all the way through Week 12 or 13, and then he's kind of back to a pumpkin a little bit, where it's just decent, at least per the numbers. After the Cousins verdict, what I'm watching for is, does Alexander Madison continue to be kind of a 1B or 1A running back ever since he's come in the league? If Dalvin Cook is somewhat healthy, Madison is the RB2. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's a notable eye test that said this Cook guy, the chef, is a better running back than this dude who jumps over people with these cool hurdles. Now it seems like that gap is evening, like getting closer between the two. I think that's because Alexander at Madison is now probably in his absolute prime as a running back and a football player. And when you see Madison in this last month, you're like, this son of a bitch looks good. He might look as good as Dalvin this year. In their purest forms, at least last year or 2020, Dalvin Cook was a better running back. But right now, when you watch them, they just feel like equals. Now, I don't know if Cook will have a monster game and all in the rear view here that, well, clearly he's a better running back. But for the first time ever, me watching Madison or Vikings football, I'm looking at him thinking, wow, if they just split carries between he and Cook, we'll be just fine. And I used to think, well, he ain't the back that Cook is, so we'll see what he can do today. But now it feels like they're kind of equal. So I want to know if the touches, the carries start to get more equal, even though Dalvin Cook has paid leaps and bounds more than Madison. The next one is Danielle Hunter hitting a groove. Does that start? Ed Donatel said this week that in his experience, which is vast, him personally, that edge rushers that are 4-3 defenders usually take about a month to acclimate. And you like get your watch out and you're like, well, we hit the month mark. Is it now go time for Danielle Hunter? Because his pressures are down. According to stathead.com, he has 4 pressures through 4 weeks, and that ranks 89th in the NFL among his peers. And that ain't going to work with how much money he makes. He's the second highest paid player on the Vikings behind the quarterback. And I believe, so here, let me back up. Hunter hasn't played poorly. If you go look at his Pro Football Focus grade, it's the 5th best on the Vikings at 75 point something. So it's not like he's just sucked or, this guy's a waste of money. They should have traded him when they had a chance. It doesn't feel like that. He's just not sponsoring the usual QB hurries, pressures, and sacks that we would see. And he's healthy. He appears to be healthy. So it's kind of odd that he's not doing his usual tricks, which he did in 2019 before his flurry of injuries started. So at some point or another, if indeed he's going to get with the times in this 3-4 defense, it's got to start. Because if we're doing a show next week about this, and we're like, oh, it's week 6 and Hunter is still quiet, that'd be kind of goofy. The inspirational part here is that the Bears have one of the worst offensive lines in football, if not the worst. If Hunter is ever going to have a personal get-right game and log a few sacks, now is the time. The Bears' offensive line is not good. Next up, winding down the show, is Andrew Booth. He practiced this week, which was more than he's done in the past month since he got hurt against the Packers in week 1. And wouldn't you know it, the Vikings cornerbacks aren't talked about a whole lot in the NFL. Patrick Peterson's pretty good. Cameron Dantzler's pretty good. After that, you might have a decent game from Chris Boyd. Caleb Evans is just a rookie. And then Shannon Sullivan is kind of sweet and salty, depending on how you interpret his performance. So they need Booth. We got to be done with all of these strikeouts on cornerbacks. Just all of the draft capital invested in cornerbacks, especially first-rounders that haven't panned out for one reason or another, that's got to be done. So Kwesi had to have hit on Booth to make up for the sins of the previous regime via drafting cornerbacks. In fact, the only good cornerback that the previous regime, and that would be Spielman, drafted in the last decade was Xavier Rhodes. Other guys weren't really worth a first-rounder. Trey Waynes was pretty good, but you really wouldn't be like, yeah, what a badass for a first-rounder. You'd be like, yeah, he was a good cornerback. Mike Hughes didn't work out, and, rest in peace to Jeff Gladney. But Booth's got to, the Cosmos got to get back on their axis. Booth's got to be good, and we haven't even seen him yet, so it'd be nice to see him mixed in a little bit so we can begin that process, and perhaps he's ready by Thanksgiving starting or something like that. We shall see. Second to last is the Justin Jefferson experience. The first game against the Packers looked like one of the all-time greats. The next 2 games, anemic because I don't know what happened against the Eagles. I do know that he was double-teamed against the Lions, and then he exploded again against the Saints. What I'll be watching for against the Bears, who probably won't have Jalen Johnson, their best corner, to cover Jefferson, is asking ourselves, is this what we're going to do from now on? Is this going to be feast or famine every week with Jefferson? Is it, strikeouts and home runs like baseball does nowadays? If that's the way it's got to be, fine. If the defenses want to allot their commodities to double cover him, so be it. Adam Thielen and KJ Osborne will feast. But this feast and famine stuff is kind of a new phenomenon for Jefferson. We're used to, for the most part, consistent games. He pops off for a huge one, and then the bad ones, he still has 60, 70 yards. Well, the 2 stinkers against the Eagles and Lions, he didn't hardly do a damn thing. So I want to see against the Bears if he has another explosion, or if he has a lunch pal day at the office where he has 80 yards, we'll take it. But the roller coaster of up and downs for his box scores would be new, because he doesn't usually get shut out like he was in week 2 and 3. The Bears contest should give us a good glimpse of, all right, they don't have Jalen Johnson. They're going to have to put 2 guys on him. Can those 2 flunkies slow him down, or is this going to be the Thielen Osborne show? And then finally, the Bears pass rush is average. It's not very good. It's not your grandfather's Chicago Bears defensive front. So you can just put that in your mind. The Bears defense isn't the usual defense, especially up front. And the Vikings offensive line is kind of an average bunch. And I use that optimistically because for me, average is not atrocious, shitty like it has been for a decade. So kind of a casual footnote, I want to know what gives. The Bears have an average pass rush going up against an average Vikings offensive line. The reason that it's kind of near the top of my list is because Minnesota's been going up against these beastly defensive lines with, titans of industry, Cameron Jordan. The Eagles' defensive line was just fantastic. The Lions is pretty good, not unbeatable. And then, of course, the Packers' defense. pretty commendable. So I'm glad they get one that's not like, woo. And I want to see how an offensive line that is allegedly revamped and does look revamped, especially with Ingram at right guard. It's exciting to see the Vikings offensive line in its reconditioned form, organically drafted, homegrown form, take on a pass rush that's just kind of decent. Enough of these, top 5 defenses between the Packers, Eagles, and Saints. Again, I'll reiterate, my prediction is 31-13 Vikings. As always, when I have a margin that big, I hope that I'm not eating a bunch of crow on this show or on my way home, but such is life when you make predictions weekly. But we will talk more in detail about that game on Monday. And Skol, baby.